Hip thrusts in recent years have been a much beloved lift in the strength and conditioning world, and it's not entirely without merit. It's a favorite to many recreational bodybuilders, especially women or those just generally looking to grow their glutes. However, today I'm here to actually tell you why I don't think it's worth pursuing on its own as a main lift. The primary reason why I am against this is it's not that great for bodybuilding if your goal isn't bigger glutes. It's not really good for strength training unless you specifically need bigger glutes, but even then there's probably something more specific you could do for that. And it's supposedly supposed to make you more athletic, but any lower body compound that is sufficiently heavy or allows you to express power will increase your athleticism anyway. So I think we should actually start by looking at the hypertrophy aspect, because that's what most people are going to use the hip thrust for. So it's no secret that hip thrusts are a favorite, especially among women in the gym, using the hip thrust as a primary glute builder, and less commonly among men as well. They often use it as a first exercise of the day, typically somewhere between 5 and 12 reps, 3 to 5 sets, something like that. However, I believe this shouldn't really ever take the role of a primary movement for bodybuilding, because despite the fact that it is ultimately a heavy compound movement, unlike squats, deadlifts, and lunges, which develop the leg and glutes in a more balanced fashion, those who use heavy hip thrusts as a first movement are essentially performing a sort of isolation style variation as their first movement. This is made worse by the fact that most people don't have a glute weak point in their physique, so placing it first essentially forces the posterior to dwarf the rest of the leg, which is not good for a balanced physique. Although there are multiple schools of thought on whether the hip thrust is a hip hinge or a knee flexion, aka whether it's more related to squats or deadlifts, right? I'm inclined to say that neither is true, because the typical form of a hip thrust minimally stimulates the vital muscles of either hip hinges or knee flexions, which the adductors, hamstrings, and quads receiving almost no relevant stimulus. It is very possible to grow a big posterior from squats and deadlifts, and I don't think it's very controversial to say that you won't really grow big legs from hip thrusts. So by opening lower body training with a hip thrust, what you're essentially doing is you're allowing the glutes to become pre-fatigued and become the primary focus of the day. So if you open with your hip thrust, your glutes are going to be tired when you go into, say, your squats afterwards, or your deadlifts, or Romanian deadlifts, or lunges, and your glutes are going to become the limiting factor. And that's great if your goal is glute hypertrophy, but if your goal is general leg development, it is essentially the worst idea you can have. Because of the pre-fatigue, the glutes will now become the limiting factor of each and every exercise, meaning that there isn't a ton of benefit to the other muscles. It's not so much that they won't get worked, it's that they will be getting worked like significantly less than they otherwise would be. Now, if you really wanted to do this in a bodybuilding context and do get your extra glute volume, you would probably just prescribe it later in the workout, maybe like a third leg exercise. So say you did like squats, lunges, and then you could do hip thrusts, I guess. If you really wanted to do the hip thrusts and get that extra glute volume in. But you would probably just, like I said, do it later, and you do it for higher reps, probably like 10 to 15 reps. Or you could ditch it entirely and include something that still works wonders for your glutes, but also the rest of your leg. So you could do like lunges, or you could do a 45-degree back extension, a single leg press. That would be all amazing things to do, which would not only grow your glutes, but the rest of your leg in tandem. Also, from a hypertrophy context, there is the added time loading up the hip thrust and warming up for the hip thrust properly. Because being a heavy compound movement, anyone who gets really strong, they often talk about this, it takes ages to warm up properly to make sure that you are ready to go for your top sets. So if you're doing heavy hip thrusts, sets of 5, sets of 8, or between that, you're looking at like, even small women can do 405 for lots of reps. So if you're going to use it as a heavy, like, mass building exercise, it's just not going to be conducive to a short workout, which means you're likely going to get less work done, or you're going to spend too much time in the gym and burn yourself out. From a sort of general strength and powerlifting perspective, it shows its lack of application for most people, once again, because most people who do hip thrusts would, in a strength context, do it for their carryover to squats and deadlifts, or weighted carries or whatever if they're a strongman. And although having larger glutes will no doubt help those lifts, it is not an excuse to avoid simply practicing the main lift, and it is also not a replacement for practicing the main lift, because squatting and hinging, they are skills, and if you don't practice those skills, they're not actually going to progress and you're not going to refine your technique. So again, we see that from a hypertrophy context, if you want to use the hip thrust to feed your main lifts as a tertiary movement to bring up your prime movers, that's a entirely different thing. But if you're using it as a main movement, that is not going to be conducive to getting very much stronger, at least as strong as you could be or as fast as you could get stronger, compared to using a more holistic approach to developing your lower body through compound movements, especially with your primary lift. So instead of using a hip thrust to target your deadlift lockout, you might actually get more out of something like a Rubish back extension to actually target the hamstrings and the erectors and the upper back in a more specific methodology to the deadlift, or to your other hinges. Or a pause deadlift would also work very well, or even a banded deadlift, where the lockout gets harder because the weight that you're experiencing increases as you actually pull through the rest of the lift. Same sort of thing with squats. If you find that you're having trouble building up your glutes, or if you have a glute or posterior weakness, you can do things like tempo squats or pause squats. You could even do wide squats. You could switch to low bar. You could also just put more volume into your other hinges, like your back extensions, your RDLs, your stiff leg deadlifts, your good mornings. All of that type of stuff is going to have more carryover to the squat than a hip thrust. Or you can just put more single leg work in there as well. Single leg work, I think, is a much more potent tertiary movement compared to a hip thrust, because the hip thrust will essentially just develop the glutes very well, whereas single leg work like reverse lunges or single leg press, that's going to develop your adductors, your quads, your glutes, even your abductors as well very well. It's going to develop coordination. It's quite squat specific, it's knee flexion specific. So I think, again, we've shown that the hip thrust is kind of quite overhyped and overshadowed by more useful developmental movements that are tools that are both more specific and more holistic at the same time. Once again, relegating the hip thrust to some extra hypertrophy work done for higher reps after your main work, which again can add up and help your lifts, but if you're thinking adding 100 pounds to your hip thrust for reps is going to put 100 pounds on your deadlift for reps, you'll probably find out pretty quick that you've wasted your time and you've got a whole lot of cake, but nothing to celebrate about. In terms of athleticism, as far as power production is concerned, that's one of the main merits that people try and sell with the hip thrust. Peak force production, power production, that sort of thing, is concerned with the ability to take the glutes from a fully lengthened to a fully contracted position, and actually being able to use that ability to engage your glutes can have real carryover to things like running and jumping. But the question is the hip thrust worth the opportunity cost in an athletic program in which you already have sport-specific training and you're likely having GPP, so some sort of cardio or conditioning, some other sport that the athlete might be playing? They're probably doing some kind of Olympic lifting, things like power cleans, snatches, front squats, all that sort of stuff, which takes up a lot of recovery as is. They have their upper body work they need to squeeze in there. Also things like parachute running, weighted jumps. If you want to develop athleticism, there are higher priority things that you could be doing on top of their regular back squats and deadlifts, of course, which are not always included in athletic programs, but tend to be included quite often. Of keynote really should be the Olympic lifts. A lot of people put a lot of stock in hip thrusts insofar as they have the capacity to train the glutes in the contracted position for that peak force production. But let's be real, what do you think will have the ability to develop more posterior chain explosiveness and strength in the contracted position? A hip thrust or a power clean? The nature of a power clean is explosiveness. Same with the power snatch. You're either explosive enough to make the lift or you are not. You can't grind the first or second pull of an Olympic lift, and for that reason, they're prized as tools for developing athletic capacity. The hip thrust, by contrast, is something you can grind. It's a lift that you can strain in. You can kind of treat it more like a deadlift or a squat or a bench press insofar as it won't develop power the same way because it's not having power as the limiting factor of the exercise. So it's kind of like, it won't make you a worse athlete, but doing any other lower body heavy compound movement is likely to make you a better athlete than you would be in place of hip thrusts. It's just more time efficient. It's a better way to go about using your time and your training resources, because athletic training, you tend to have a pretty packed schedule. So why should you do what is essentially an isolation lift for your glutes when in reality you could be doing all kinds of lunges, squats, Olympic lifts, anything like that. So I think we as lifters should be careful about how we treat this, because despite all of what I said, I don't think hip thrusts are like a bad lift. They're just a very niche one. And as a community, we shouldn't look at the hip thrust or the glutes as having some kind of mythical power to blow up all your lifts or to make you better at athletics, or even be something that you should focus on in your physique. I think that at this point, it's pretty obvious that it really shouldn't be a priority for 99% of people. The only exceptions being those who are unable to do anything else to effectively develop their glutes, which is very, very rare. Or they simply wish to build the biggest glutes that they actually can. In researching for this video, I did watch a few videos from the famed Brett Contreras. You've probably seen a few clips of some of the videos that I watched in this video. And although he does make a good case for hip thrusts as an incredibly safe and effective lift that you could do as a main lift for those primarily interested in building glutes, it would kind of be disingenuous to say that strongmen, powerlifters, and those interested in bodybuilding outside the limitations of most of his clients, which tend to be like bikini division bodybuilders, should use it as a primary lift. One, because if you're doing hip thrusts as a primary lift in strongman, well, you're missing out on a potential deadlift day you could have. If you're doing them as a primary lift in a powerlifting program, you're missing out on a potential squat day you could have. If you're doing them from a bodybuilding perspective, you're setting up yourself using pre-fatigue to steal work from the rest of your lower body. It's just not, it's not the move for most people. As a main lift, no. As a main lift, absolutely not. No. But if you want to do 2 or 3 sets after your actual main lifts, like your squats, your deadlifts, your cleans, front squats, lunges, whatever, for like 10 to 15 reps, that's fine. You'll still get that extra glute volume. It will benefit you. It will eventually reach over and become something which will affect you. It's kind of like how bench pressers, some of the best bench pressers in the world, they do a lot of tricep and pec and even front delt isolation. They don't do that because it makes their bench press better strictly, although there could be a case made in the case of the tricep work, but your dumbbell flies won't carry over to your bench press insofar as they carry over from a technical perspective, but simply the fact that you will have bigger pecs will carry over to your bench press. It's kind of the same with the hip thrust and with glutes. The hip thrust is its own movement pattern. I think Brett himself has been really trying to push the idea that it's a horizontal hip extension movement or something. I forget the term he used, but it's its own pattern. It doesn't have carryover in the same way. It's kind of like comparing an overhead press to a bench press and saying that, oh, if you do the overhead press, it's going to carry over to your bench. Like, yeah, there's some truth there, but it's not really the same thing. What I would recommend instead is putting in other accessory work, things like leg curl variations, ab work, lunges, anything like that, which will, the lunges especially, will grow your glutes. But I know for a fact most people are not doing enough of those three things. A last thing I would like to offer is an alternative to the hip thrust, which are hyperextensions, both 45 degrees and 90 degrees, which Brett Contreras himself is really a huge fan of. It's going to be more specific to your hinges. It's going to more holistically develop the posterior chain. It takes less time to warm up for, and you will still grow massive and strong glutes simply due to the nature of the exercise. And there's a basis for programming these as a main lift in their own right as well, or as a perfect movement to complement your other hinges. Bald Omni-Man, in his Dragon Slayer 9-week reusable program, programs Rubish extensions and 90-degree back extensions as the majority of your posterior chain work for that whole developmental period. Now, of course, in the last couple of weeks, you do switch to more specific work, but that's simply for the sake of having it be a sort of periodized program with different blocks within it. All of that within those exercises will contribute to you having a stronger backside and a larger backside if that's really what you're interested in. So that's why I think hip thrusts are kind of an overhyped and meme lift. If you have any disagreements with the points I made in the video, please be sure to leave them in the comments. I would love to spend my day thinking of a perfect reply that you will inevitably ignore. Like the video if you found the video helpful or informative, and subscribe if you want more content like this. That's all I have for now. Take care, train hard, and have a great day.
Now, if you watch this video and this doesn't make complete, total sense to you, then what world do I live in?